Good morning, everybody. I'm John Morton of NRI. You'll see a bit more of me this afternoon when I chair the climate change session, but for now, I'm just here to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker for today, but I think she will have things to say of great relevance to all four of the sessions we've had. So our keynote speaker today is Professor Marta Rivera Ferre, who is a research professor at Ingenio, which is a joint research center of the Spanish National Research Council and the Polytechnic University of Valencia. Marta is one of those remarkable, some might say foolhardy people who have two PhDs, one in animal science and one in sociology. She's also someone who can talk about both the issues of the global north and the global south. She's just actually come back from Nepal, but also researches particularly pastoral systems in the Mediterranean, including the Pyrenees. We first met when we worked on the rural areas chapter of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, which was a great experience, and Marta then went on to work as a lead author on food security in the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and as review editor on the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, and has also served on the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development and the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, and she's also a member of a number of other panels of experts and boards. So Marta has a particular interest in the potential of local traditional agri-food knowledge in adaptation to climate change, in food security and in food sovereignty, and also on the adoption of feminist and commons theories in agri-food research and the way different discourses coexist in agricultural research and agricultural development. So she'll be speaking today on rights-based and systemic approaches to food and nutrition security in the context of climate change. She'll be speaking for about 40 minutes, and I hope we'll have time for questions after that. So here is Marta. Thank you.
I think I don't need this, or like this is okay, right? Okay. Okay, thank you, John, for the introduction and for the invitation to your event to close in this FaNSI program, which I heard has been very successful, so congratulations to the NRI. So as John mentioned, today we'll just provide you with some general view. I have based my speak today on these different reports, so I will not be talking about each of them, but of different elements which are common on all of them, which I think they are very relevant in the context of food and nutrition security when we are looking for the transformation of food system, when we are looking for equality, when we are looking for inclusion, and all these kind of things. And I want to highlight that the whole presentation today will have I will be talking about these 5 topics mainly, which is the relevance of complexity when we are dealing with science policy interfaces. In our research, if we don't address complexity, then we can come out with some conclusions, some outcomes for policymakers that might not be the best options, as I will show now. Also, the relevance of framing when we develop these solutions, these responses, so our framing of our research, the framing of policymakers, how this affects the different solutions that are finally selected, and of course the relevance of transformation, because we all know that food systems need to be really transformed, and the way they are running now, we are going to chaos and, well, nothing that you don't know. Actually, I won't spend time here because I think everyone knows here the centrality of food systems, both in terms of ecological and social dimensions at the global level. We know from the planetary boundaries that food systems contribute to 5 of these 9 planetary boundaries, particularly land use, biodiversity, the geochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, the use of fresh water, and of course climate change. Also, they are central in all SDGs. I like very much this infographic from the FAO where they were showing how food systems have connections with all of the 17 SDGs. So I think this is something I will not stop. We will need another talk just to mention all these particular points. And we know also that these are, the main challenges of food production, of part of food systems, in terms of, that we need to achieve food security. We have problems of all forms of malnutrition, undernutrition, obesity and overweight, hidden hunger. We need to adapt to climate change while also reducing emissions from food systems because, as you know, and I will mention later, and probably will be mentioned afternoon during the session of climate change, the food system contribute to 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions on average. Of course, it contributes to the livelihoods and dignified life of billions of people in the world. And there is also a major concern of inequality linked to food systems, both at the production and the consumption side, because we also know that the problems of food security, including overweight and obesity, and of course undernutrition, it's really heavy burden on people with lower resources. And this is also happening in a context of limited inputs, where there is a high degradation of terrestrial and water ecosystems. There is biodiversity loss. We have 1 million species from the last IPBES assessment, which are in danger of extinction. Increases of volatility of price, which is subject of many different issues, but there are geopolitical issues which are, directly impacting our food systems, creating problems, but also, climate change is also facilitating volatility increases of the prices of food products. Of course, in the context of increasing population, conflicts, so really pandemics, so we really are in a very difficult context. And as I was saying before, in this context, we know we need to transform the food systems, or otherwise we will not be able to achieve the SDGs, we will not be able to achieve the Paris Agreement and many other agreements that we already have, conventions, biodiversity convention agreements, and so on. So we are really in a very, food system really play a central role on all these discussions, although it's not always visible the centrality of this role. So, in this context, we as researchers have a huge responsibility to really put on the table the complexity of the problem and the complexity when we analyze food system, particularly in these science policy spaces. And I want to give you this example of something that I consider was a failure in terms of communication and also in terms of analysis. In 2009, the FAO produced this report where, as a quite basic analysis, they were suggesting that we needed to increase 70% production by 2015 because we need to feed 10,000 people by that time. 10,000 million people, sorry, not 10,000, because otherwise it would be very easy by that time, right? And this, of course, created a lot of, media communication and a lot of discussions and everything. And to my surprise, because I actually thought that this was already overcome, normally we move in our own bubbles and we don't realize sometimes what is happening out of your bubble. 2 weeks ago, we had, this is in Spanish, I'm sorry, but I wanted to highlight it here because this was published 2 weeks ago. It was in one of the major newspapers in Spain by one important person of the agronomy engineering. We have a very a strong drought now happening in Spain, so big problem for production. And here they were mentioning again that we need to increase 70% the production of food by 2015 to feed all people. No? And of course, these type of messages are very kind of, or come from a very simple analysis of the reality of food security and the reality of the food systems, right? So they are mainly centered on that part, food availability, but we know food security is a very is a multi-dimension concept where we have the 4 classical components of food security, which is availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability, of course. and 2 new more that were proposed by the high-level panel of experts of food nutrition security of the United Nations Commission, which is Agency and Sustainability. So the whole report was based only on availability, so how much food we produce to feed the people, more like analyzing not literally, but mostly a linear effect, cause effect, and of course that gives very wrong conclusions. In the Spatial report of land, we analyzed, we took the series from 1960 to 2000, and we of course saw that there has been an increase in the production from the 1960s, when the Green Revolution was already adopted in most countries, or started to be adopted in most countries in the world. So we have had really a high increase of food production, which is much more than the increase in population, but of course we still have this average number of 800 million, which normally is about this time, 700 million or 850 million, but this is the range where we normally move in terms of undernutrition, people who suffer from hunger every year, according to the FAO statistics. But also we have created a new problem, because we know that there have been a change in the consumption trends along this time as a result of the nutrition transition, where we have changed our diets globally, and we have passed from locally based diets, traditional diets, toward what is called the Western diets, which is composed by or characterized by high level consumption of proteins, animal protein, sugar, processed food or ultra-processed foods, and all these kind of things. And of course, this has an impact. So in fact, what we have had in this, or we have witnessed in the past decades, is that we have passed from a food deficit to a food surplus, right? So really, this type of messages where we say that because we are increasing population, we need to produce food, when we know the impacts that it has in the ecosystem, the production of food, when particularly we are producing food not from a sustainable, not in a sustainable manner, it has huge implications, right? So this is why I think we have a very huge responsibility when we are working in these science policy spaces to really show, perform complex analysis, not really go to simplify the reality. And of course, we need to educate policymakers that the reality is complex, because sometimes we say, okay, because the policymakers, they want just figure, they want just a number. No, we also need to educate them that the reality is much more complex than that. No? And luckily, in the last decades, also the science policy interface and all these global reports are also evolving towards this type of complexity analysis, which I will show you now. So just to continue with the problem of this type of assertion, as I say, we have now a food surplus, but they didn't analyze, of course, the increase in meat consumption that we have already witnessed also from the 1960s, particularly production or the consumption of pig, monogastric, so pig and poultry, where we now are on average, it's about 73% of the total meat that we consume globally. And of course, if we want to even go further in the analysis, we could say who is eating this food, and we can see that not all countries in the world are eating this meat, and not all countries of the world are responsible for this increase in the use of resources to produce the meat, right? So all these kind of things are already necessary. Yesterday you had the session on food loss and waste. We cannot do this analysis from a food system perspective when we don't say that 1/3 of the food that is produced is never eaten, because it's lost. It's lost or waste, during the transport before it reaches the consumption place, or it's wasted in the household level. And there are differences here between the global and south context, but in general, what we know is that that we have 1/3 of food lost, and of course this we need to consider, because then why do we want to produce more if we are wasting 1/3, or we never eat 1/3 of what we are producing? So that is absolutely nonsense. But still, as I say, I was surprised that 2 weeks ago, this message that was released in 2009 still is in the heads of many scientists. And I think this is something which is very, very important, because then we have this responsibility. And this is how we are now seeing that the complexities emerge in the reports. So these are 2 figures from the IPCC Working Group 2 6 Assessment Report. This is from Chapter 5, which is the chapter on food. And this is for agriculture, and food security. And this is one from Chapter 8, which is the one on livelihoods, poverty, and development. And here you can see they show the complexity, they show there are cascading effects, they show there are many different interactions between climate change and food security, and there is no a linear cause-effect direction to understand what will be the problems of the future regarding food security in the context of climate change, right? So hopefully, likely, as I was saying, now we have more complexity. So from the past report, from 2009 till now, we have now in the scientific arena, we have much more complex analysis. We have the One Health, to show, for instance, the relationship between the human health, livestock, animal health, and planetary health. Or we have nexus assessment. Right now, there is 2 nexus reports that are running at the global level, which is in the context of the IPBES, which is the nexus of biodiversity, health, food, water, in the context of climate change. I say health? Yes, health. And then also there is the nexus assessment of the Mediterranean countries. So really now a lot of science policy spaces where we are dealing with the topic of food security, with the topic of food and nutrition security more for a complex perspective to really provide responses to policymakers. Of course, they are the ones who have to decide, because we as researchers, we cannot be prescriptive in this type of assessments, but we really need to do, and it's our responsibility to have really rigorous analysis of the reality, right? And avoid, as I say, this simplified analysis. So as I say, many things now, also including ethics dimensions and many different issues, to really understand that in the case of food systems are complex socio-ecological systems, and this is where we need to start to talk about food systems in the context of climate change. The interesting of this is that when we introduce complexity in our analysis, then also we start to look at different issues. So in the mainstream analysis of food security, we've been looking for many years to productivity, with a productivity focus, and looking at indicators like kilograms per hectare of maize, kilograms per hectare of wheat or whatever, And despite this is a relevant indicator, it's not the indicator that will help us to understand how much food, how much people we can feed in a given context, right? Because people don't eat only maize, people don't eat only wheat, people is, to have a sustainable and healthy diet, we really need to have a diverse diet. And here we can see that they are starting to propose new indicators to say, okay, so we go to measure yields from tons, to measure yields in terms of how much people feed per hectare. And here again, then we move, and this has implications. It has major implications because indicators measure is an objective measure, but of course, it comes from what I want to measure, which is subjective, right? So it's not the same that they want to measure productivity in terms of kilograms per hectare of monoculture, right? And implies one system of production, one model of production, which is more industrial-based, which is more, as I mentioned later, focused on the market and leading the market as the one that addresses the problems of food security. So people through the market will be able to achieve food and nutrition security. When I'm measuring numbers of tons, numbers of people fed per hectare, then I'm interested in a different model. Then my model will be polycultures, more thinking on how I can feed the people which is within the territory. So as you see, the indicators have major implications on the type of system. And sometimes I've been working on agroecology, as I will show later, for several years, I would say now decades. And we have been trying, because to answer to the question how much people we can feed using these kilograms per hectare, until we realize that really this is not the indicator we need to use. No, the indicator we need to use is completely different. So we are now mixing, we say in Spanish, churras with merinas. I don't know if there is a translation for this in English, but basically churra is one sheep breed, merinas is another sheep breed that you cannot, they're completely different. So in Spanish we say, maybe you say apples with orange? I don't know, in English, anyway. So, but we are mixing or comparing things that cannot be compared because we need really completely different indicators to address the same issue, right? Also here, interesting, when we change the way we do research, also new subjects emerge. we look at the reality, as I say, with different indicators, and then we realize, for instance, in the conventional system, and this is very relevant, particularly in the global north, and all the global north agricultural policies have focused on the need of small-scale farmers to increase the scale, because, of course, in the way to increase the scale, when you have competitive advantage in the market, and then it is when you are efficient farmers. But now, when we look at the numbers, what we see with this more complex perspective is that the small-scale farmers are the ones who are more productive in terms of feeding the world, right? And then now the whole things change. No? Now we have the focus not in that they need to increase to be the scale to be more efficient, but we need really to support these farmers the way they are, to, of course, because they can increase yields, but we don't really want to impose them to increase the scalability of the production. Right. Something similar with climate change, right? And now I'm going to talk as well a little bit about the contentious issue, which is the issue of livestock in the context of climate change. This debate is an ongoing debate, but I think it's very relevant to highlight also how we approach this topic. No? So with climate change and food system, we all know we need to reduce emissions from the food system. It contributes about 1/3, as I say. This is from the land report. And when we look at the last assessment report, this is from Working Group 3, the 6th assessment report, and we could see here, no, we don't go beyond the analysis, as I say, a complex analysis of the numbers of the data. Here we could think that Europe is doing well, particularly well. So from the 19th to 2019, we are reducing our emissions to our agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, because as you know, emissions are measured by sectors, and in the case of agriculture, it's part of the agriculture, forestry, and land use, right? So it's the AFOLU sector. And you could say, okay, that's perfect, because we are doing well, no? We are really reducing our emissions of the sector. But of course, when you increase the perspective from a food system perspective, and we can see that what is happening here, and here responds to the demand from European and North American countries, then we cannot say just, no, okay, in national inventories we are doing well, because we really need to introduce what in the ecological science they call telecoupling effects, which is where we include the demand with the consumption, try to understand that the responsibility here goes beyond these countries or these regions, right? It's a global responsibility where we need to tackle also consumption in the northern countries, or otherwise we are cheating, because we say we are emitting less, but of course what we are doing is externalizing our emissions towards other regions of the world. And this is the type of analysis, as I said, that we really need to introduce complexity. Unfortunately, the national inventories, personally, I've been asking this question in all the reports, and when I've been talking with the people who are working on national inventories, still don't take data based on the consumption production. So still we have data collected in that way, and this is, as I say, gives just a partial, a part of the reality. No? So this is not the whole picture. And something similar with the livestock, no? As I was mentioning. So I like this. I mean, this is an old figure, but I like it very much because in the last report they don't have a figure which is as clear as this one, but still maybe the numbers have changed, but not the concept. Basically, we can see here, of course, that cattle meat, in terms of direct emissions, they are huge. No? So they produce, because of the enteric fermentation, they produce methane, and they have big contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions, right? This is direct emissions, but when we introduce, and of course here we have now all the issue that we need to reduce meat consumption, which is true, as you have seen in my previous message, in my previous slides, particularly in some countries of the world, we have a huge increase of meat and animal protein, which is causing a lot of health problems linked to the diet, apart of course from the health problems in terms of planetary health, right? But what I think is relevant here is now we are starting to get all these messages that we need to reduce meat, and the cows are, we blame cows for being, causing the climate change. And ruminant animals, as I say, cows, we eat 22% of the meat we consume is cows. Small ruminants is about 2-3%. It's very, very little amount of the meat we consume globally, right? So it's mostly, as I say, 77% is monogastric. And when we look at the GLIM, which is the global livestock emissions and agricultural model of the FAO, of the livestock section of the FAO, we can see that, of course, enteric fermentation, this is how you know the percentage of emissions in the livestock sector per type of activity. And we see that enteric fermentation is 44%, but feed is 41%. And feed is normally produced to feed monogastrics, right? That is relating to deforestation and land use change, to produce soya or to produce other types of crops which is needed to feed these animals. And this is very similar to the figure I showed before, where you see that production is happening in one side, consumption is happening on another side, but the emissions we blame the emissions for some regions of the world, right? And here we have a similar issue, no? So we have that these animals, no monogastrics, of course, they produce less in terms of direct emissions, but they are responsible not only because a lot of cattle in some part of the world, they also are fed with this type of feed, but I think that the message and the analysis really needs to get much more complex. And here we have another issue of complexity, again, going back to metrics and indicators. Normally, because we are still analyzing reality from a productivity focus, most of this type of data, of the life cycle analysis, which is the type of data that is used to do this type of analysis, is presented in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of product. So per kilogram of milk, per kilogram of meat, or whatever. So in that case, monogastric and intensive production systems are favored because they are more efficient in terms of how much food how much meat, how much milk they produce, right? But when we want to look, for instance, in terms of fatty acid profile, then we see in terms of some of micronutrients, then we find that grass-fed animals will be more efficient in terms of kilogram of CO2 equivalents per amount of fatty acid profile or micronutrients. And we are talking now that we want to talk about food and nutrition security, not only in terms of how much food I eat, but on the quality of the food I eat, right? There is also other type of metrics that also are relevant in the context, in the current context of ecological crisis and social problems, which is, for instance, the issue of land use, no? And here we can see that we presented data in terms of kilograms of CO2 per area of prime arable land required, or we presented data of kilograms of CO2 per non-human edible food, whatever, then again, we will have that extensive animal production system, ruminant production system will be more efficient. So again, we really need to present the reality not based just on, global a number based on only one way of looking at reality, which is this productivity, when we know that, in any case, we need to reduce the amount of meat consumed in some part of the world, but really to look at, the interaction with the ecosystem, the interaction with the quality of diets, the interaction with different other issues that are relevant, and that will result in different data regarding livestock emissions. Here is also an issue, For instance, we normally provide data in terms of kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of produce, as I said, but normally because these animals eat more, because they produce more, they are more efficient in the way they produce. In absolute terms, not in relative terms, they produce more kilograms of methane per animal than the ones which are grown in other parts of the world, like in Africa or India, So these kind of things, I think, is important, because otherwise we miss the opportunity to really get to here, basically, which is this data is from the Lancet report of the planetary health, planetary diet, And here we know that agricultural sector, food systems is the only sector that has the capacity not only to reduce emissions, but to have net carbon sequestration. And of course, to achieve that, we need major transformations, of course. But here, livestock, well-managed livestock in highly degraded areas, because of course this is based on carbon sequestration potential in the soil, plays a role. So if we dismiss and we start saying that livestock, we need to reduce meat consumption from ruminants all over the world and everything like this, then we can miss this opportunity. So we really need to have more refined analysis, and this is still an ongoing discussion, of course, so this is not like the one I presented before that is very clear, not linear, food security, food production, and people case, but this is still ongoing discussion, but I think it's very important to bear in mind that has huge repercussions for millions of people in the world who are pastoralist people, who are people working on extensive livestock production, and they really contribute to more than meat, they contribute to really livelihoods of billions. That said, as I previously mentioned, luckily the reports are getting more and more, the science policy reports are getting more and more complex in the analysis. And here we can see, I am super fan of the land report, and you can see how we can analyze different response options, but we only look not only at mitigation potential, but we look at adaptation potential, reducing desertification, land degradation, food security. So really, when we analyze one response option, we don't look only to a contribution to one objective. We really need to look at the contribution of multiple objectives, because we have multiple objectives in the current context. Here we could have added biodiversity, we could have added, other like autonomy of farmers or whatever. And here, give us a better picture of which are the response options that can have more potential in terms of addressing multiple issues at the same time. But of course, the reality goes beyond just the practices. Here we can say, okay, for agriculture, soil management, or conservation agriculture, of course, depends on the context and everything, but all of this occurs in a social context. It's not something that happens in a bubble and we can just use one practice or one strategy that can be used everywhere in the world, but this happens in a social context. And here, again, I think the reports are getting more accurate as well, and they introduce this type of analysis, for instance, like the feasibility assessment, to really understand the economic, technological, institutional, sociocultural, ecological, and geophysical feasibility of several response options. That table, which I like it very much, actually, this is not the one that has been published, but I prefer that one to the one that was published. I think it's more clear, of chapter 13 of the working group 2 ARC's assessment working group 2, right? So this is for the European context. But I think, it really shows how the assessment gets more and more complex to understand how different response options need to be tackled, with this more complex perspective. Here, for instance, this is from chapter 13, and here we can see again how different climate response options are linked to the achievement of the SDGs, right? So really very much elaborated assessments. And now, what I'm also very happily, living and witnessing, I don't know, is that we are going even further than that, This is a report published last year from the IPBES. This is a values report of the International Intergovernmental Platform of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And there they have been analyzing how the values we have as people can affect, in that case, our relation with nature, because Biodiversity and Ecosystem Survey Platform, they work morely from the focus of biodiversity, while the IPCC, of course, works with climate change. And it's very interesting because they identify, after the whole 3 years process, 4 different types of values, of relations with nature. So it's living from nature, which is more anthropocentric, more instrumental values in our relation with nature. Living in nature, which is, again, they identify more as an anthropocentric perspective. Living with nature, and living as nature. So we can collect, when we are, again, in the science policy interface, we cannot impose our view, because we are in the global north, we are more working in living from nature, and in some context, probably living in nature. But in other parts of the world, they are working more in the sense that they feel the relation with nature is living as nature. So we as humans are part of nature. So that, of course, implies completely different response options in terms of policy making. And that's something that they have been working. And now we also did, and as I will show now, for food. No? So in the food security, food and nutrition security, we also need to put on the table which values and how we relate to food when we are to develop response options. And this is what I'm talking about later, about the rights-based approaches. So since our target is transformation, right? Our target is transformation, and the response options, we want to contextualize them in the objective of transform our food systems, which is in that room, our object of study. But transformation can occur at different levels, right? So this is work from Karen O'Brien, and here we know that the lowest level of transformation is when we go for technical solutions. There is a second level of transformation which goes more to change system and structures, and then the highest level of transformation when we change values, when we change values, when we change our worldviews, right? And here, this is what I say now. I like it very much, the IPBES assessment, because they went to here. And right now, also, I talk about the Nexus assessment, but also the IPBES are producing a new assessment, which is the transformative assessment, no? The transformation assessment, to also include values and how the values are linked to transformative options, right? And this is from Siri Eriksson. I also like it very much because when she looked at the transformation, and at least from the perspective I normally work, to favor transformation towards food sustainable and inclusive food systems, we need to engage with multiple knowledges. So again, as it was very clear in the values assessment of the IPBES, we really need to look at the reality from the perspective of multiple worldviews. We need to question the subjectivities, our own subjectivities in the discourses and our problem understandings, and of course, support subjectivities of the five-year emancipation of more vulnerable actors, right? Again, here, Karen O'Brien, when she looked at the role that research can play, no, in generate knowledge with action, no, actionable knowledge, sorry. She works also with the idea to work with the incorporation of knowledge from outside academia. So, and this is mostly what the people said, what the people did in the values assessment. Actually, in this Nexus report that I'm participating, and this is different to the IPCC. So in the IPBES, as part of the scientific assessment process, they have what they call ILK dialogues. So they have a network of indigenous people and local communities that they also participate, in particular dialogues where they are presentation of the findings of the different drafts of the report in order to include their views and their perspective as part of the reassessment report, which is completely different to the IPCC, where we rely only on science research. So one type of knowledge, which is scientific knowledge at the end. So going to the values, I will skip that. In that report, these two reports from the SAPEA, which is the scientific advice from the European Academy of Science for the European Union, we identified 3 different narratives around food, which imply different values of food in society. This is food as a commodity, which is the mainstream value of food right now, which is mostly like in the case of the IPBES, living from nature type, more instrumental. This is food as a human right. That will be a different, understand different values of food. Food as a commons, food, I didn't put my, we have more food as an identity, so what we analyze is that the different type of values of food that we have implies different response options, different policies to food. And the common, we analyze the Farm to Fork strategy of the European Union, and we observe that in the end, the Farm to Fork strategy still has a food as a commodity framework. No? Like, for instance, in the Common Agricultural Policy, would like to have had a food as a human right value perspective. They will work more into facilitating the access to land. So we have witnessed, for instance, in the European Union, the land concentration during the last decades. So it's very difficult for new farmers to engage in farming because there's no land for them. It's very difficult to access this land. No? So they will put measures to facilitate the access to these resources like land. No? And they will be more focused, for instance, in the working conditions of migrant people, right? All these kind of things will be part of a common agricultural policy or a farm to fork strategy, which is more linked to the food as a human right. But here we have more food as a commodity, in which, for instance, we rely more on consumers' willingness to pay or consumers' decisions when they purchase food to really make the transitions towards sustainable and healthy diets. So, what we have seen anyway is that, at least in the reports and scientific literature, there is a lot of an increasing trend to work with the right-based approach, no? Which in our case will be food as a human right. This is from the Lancet report, the triple syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change, and they frame all the report on the human rights framework, the human right to well-being, and all the different human rights which are linked to this endemic. Or this is for the right to food, and this is from the agroecology report of the high-level panel of experts, where they are looking at agroecology as part of as an approach to address food and nutrition security from a rights perspective. No? And here we need to look at issues like participation, non-discrimination, transparency, human dignity, empowerment. So all these type of things, when we are working from a right-based approach in food, is things that we need to consider when we want to highlight, when we want to analyze response options. I will just forget about this, but I just wanted to show how in the agroecology definitions from FAO or for high-level panel of experts, we introduce all these type of things that are part of the rights-based approach thinking, way of thinking, right? Also, there are definitions from civil society organizations where they also introduce the issue of empowerment, participation, transparency, which is part of this right-based approach, right? And how, from this approach, as part of deliberative transformation, we really need to introduce in our research issues like knowledge sharing, participatory action research, to really work with people and co-produce knowledge with the affected stakeholders. But I think it's also very important here and, to understand, when we are looking from this perspective, why the agroecology report got to this table. This is not to say that sustainable intensification is worse than agroecology, no? This is just to say that agroecology, when you look at the different agroecological approaches, when you look at the different, or when you look more from a systemic perspective, introducing social elements that go beyond the practices, have better resources, better results, because it goes beyond the practices. No? It goes really introducing other social elements which are needed in order to really achieve the transformation that we are looking for. But agroecology is not, when we start, no? And this is again why we need to keep the mind and the relevance of complexity. If we start to chop, no? In that case, this is something that is happening at least in the global north, and then agroecology now is chopped into the practices, and then you have the social, the social and political and cultural dimensions, and just finishing of this response option. Then you have people that start to say, okay, we are now in people that they start to talk about junk agroecology, or no, and we start to have problems because we are again making a simplification of the reality, and we have the normal, the corporate actors using agroecological practices and saying they are doing agroecology. But again, because we are chopping the reality, chopping the complexity to really provide just focus only on the practices, but the practices themselves are not transformative. What is transformative when we are really looking at the complexity on all these dimensions. And this I forget, I will leave it. because we will have, no, because otherwise I wanted just to show how, well, agroecology has been implemented also in context of how the humanitarian, but we have later Sina that will be talking about the humanitarian context. So I will leave it here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marta, for a really stimulating and energy-raising talk. And I think the topics you've raised of complexity, I think this is very important. We as researchers tend to think our end game is reducing everything to the 30 seconds we get to talk to the minister in the lift. And maybe we have to think, of other ways of communicating what are irreducibly complex topics. Thank you for introducing the topic of metrics and choice of metrics, of values and subjectivities, and also at the end of rights-based approaches. So, a talk that really stimulated some reflection. So there's time for a few questions. Would anybody like to raise a question, and is there a roaming mic? Any questions?
You can also share experience, not only...
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm Leo Zulu, and thanks a lot for similar to the talk that I'm going to give, these indicators, social equity, so it's kind of, and I felt at home, but you are doing it at a larger scale and lots of interesting things that you are doing. Are you looking, in terms of climate change, the global stock take, in terms of adaptation, food and agriculture, are you contributing any work to that, going from the food side? Are you thinking of the global stock take with your work as well?
You mean in my work, right? I normally work in Europe. This is where I have more work, and we are working in Europe. We have a big problem. So John mentioned before, one of my research topics is the contribution of local and traditional knowledge for adaptation to climate change. And after decades of industrial farming in Europe, we are losing our traditional ecological knowledge. So people who have this knowledge are very old, and we really need, we are kind of an emergency to really recuperate this knowledge, which of course is linked to agrobiodiversity and many other things, but I'm working on that because I feel very stressed with that.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? I can't see any. In which case, I think we'll move on to the session on sustainable agricultural intensification. And again, with thanks for Marta for raising so many important questions and directing our thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we are a little bit ahead of schedule, which is good. Thank you, John. Welcome to the session on sustainable agricultural intensification, and we are really going to talk about inclusive innovations for sustainable agricultural intensification. By that we mean, making sure that the benefits of derived from sustainable intensification innovations that are equitable, that they reach the poor, that they reach all categories of society. Let me see how this works. Yeah, we have a very nice lineup of speakers today. We have Professor Anam Dey of University of Leeds, Leo Zulu of Michigan State University, Zainab Oyetunde Usman from Rothamsted Research, Professor Kolawole Adebayo of the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta in Nigeria. And then we have some NRI speakers as well, Truly Santika, Rachel Chase, and Marcos Paradelo Perez. And my name is Jonne Rodenburg. Yesterday, I think the chair forgot to introduce himself in the beginning, so that is now taken care of. And I'm also working at the Natural Resources Institute as a professor of agronomy. We will be starting this session with 2 talks from invited speakers. Anam Dey is the first one up. Anam Dey is a professor in the politics of global development in the School of Politics and International Studies at the University of Leeds. She's a social anthropologist with more than 25 years of experience in researching local service delivery and governance, integrated water resources management and understanding poverty, inequality and sustainable livelihoods. Her empirical research is primarily from Tanzania, but extends to other parts of the continent. And in recent years, she has worked extensively in large interdisciplinary projects on the political economy of water and sanitation governance. And today she will be talking about the political economy of addressing equity and social sustainability in sustainable agricultural intensification. Anna, the floor is yours.
Questions. Good morning. Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. So the pieces of work that I'm going to talk to you about today come from various pieces of research that we've been doing in Leeds, a PhD student of mine, and a piece of consultancy that I did with Lund University, in looking at this idea of sustainable agricultural intensification, and particularly the inclusive nature of it. And what does this mean in terms of, extending the benefits of this transformation that really were driving some of these innovations in agriculture towards, and a frustration with very simplistic ways of thinking about inclusion, particularly policies or initiatives that say, especially including women, especially including youth, with really no details about how that can be done, what that means, thinking about women and youth as these big monolithic groups. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens in the type of research that we do within the development industry itself, and really how might we move beyond some of these sort of simplified approaches. I'm also going to be talking about this problem of policy and this influencing of policy, and really trying to push the idea that actually we have to engage with the politics of policy. Because if we only think about policy, we tend to depoliticize the whole process of choices, of the arguments that are embedded in all of these resource sharing type issues that we're looking at, and in levels of responsibility, accountability, blame for how problems are framed. And very often, if we only look at global discourse, we really miss the middle and the local politics that's actually fundamental to implementation, and particularly to this aim of inclusive transformation in agriculture. Right, where's this? So I'm sort of increasingly frustrated with our big global plans, the Sustainable Development Goals. I now spend a lot of time critiquing the Sustainable Development Goals and all that's embedded in them. And increasingly our institutions have jumped on board of these things as if they're some form of corporate branding. Every university wants to pin us and our research to Sustainable Development Goals. But we really must look critically at what's embedded within these sorts of goals, these sorts of framings, the sorts of mainstream narratives, the way we talk about problems and framing. Because this is one of the problems that I think is that we think we're talking about inclusion, and actually we're hiding the politics that makes exclusion. So we never tackle inclusion really because we don't really talk about it at all. So what is this sustainable agricultural transformation? And what makes it inclusive? And in general, I think I want to sort of talk broadly about agricultural transformation, and this is an area that I've been around for a long time. I was having memory flashbacks of coming to an event that could have been in Greenwich about 20 years ago on sustainable livelihoods approaches, which were a huge trend, very much sponsored by DFID, from the work of Robert Chambers, Ian Scoones, thinking about holistic, empowering, complex approaches to understanding livelihoods and how they might be made more sustainable, more resilient to shocks and stresses, all of that language, all of the language that actually we still hear elements of throughout things like sustainable agricultural intensification, climate smart agriculture, and so on. So all these words, all these ideas, participatory, empowering, and so on, have been around for a very long time in our lexicons. But we haven't really done a very good job of actually acting on them, of closing this gap between good policy intention and implementation in practice. And that's what I've become slightly obsessed with, is why does this gap exist between these nice words that we have and these nice intentions on paper to be very inclusive, to share the benefits, to address these power dimensions, and really what we actually see, which is almost the opposite, actually. We see worsening inequality. We see worsening sort of access to land and so on. We see worsening environmental degradation. So in terms, though, of thinking about this women and youth thing, so much of our attempts at inclusivity have been boiled down to just add women and youth. And why is that? Well, because it actually depoliticizes the problem. So the issue is women weren't in the room. Well, we just better invite some women to the meeting. Women aren't in leadership. Well, we'll appoint a woman in this position. As if that then addresses really sort of fundamental power institutional problems about how resourcing is shared. Behind this also has arisen a whole industry of promotion around gender. Gender has become, you know, one of the new sellable things. We have to add gender to every project. Everyone's a gender expert. A bit like HIV was, to be honest, in the time when I was doing my PhD, or climate change is. So it's a fashion. But a lot of what is written, and particularly within the development industry and lots of NGO work, are based on very weak myths, gender myths, that aren't really very well supported by evidence. And I think, Marty, you were talking about how these stats get plucked out of reports. And we have some particular stats that come to represent, you know, women own 1% of global land, for example. Women are responsible for this much production, or, you know, 70% of the world's poor are women. These sort of headline myths that actually circulate around what we do and frame the way we think about inclusivity. I'm very interested in a set of work that talks about this type of way of seeing development as an anti-politics machine. Those of you around anthropology or the more political sides of development may have come across this book, The Anti-Politics Machine by James Ferguson, from the 1990s now, talking about how development itself as an industry actually wants to take out the politics. It wants to render technical the choices that we make, so that if only we have the right indicators, if only we have the right science, a rational solution will become blindingly obvious, and this sort of rational policymaker, this mythical policymaker, will say, oh yes, that is the right thing to do, I'll go ahead and do it. Now we know that the world doesn't really work like that it is a great deal more complex and difficult. But what we've also embedded is seeing like a neoliberal state into what we do. And this is what I'm saying, my problem with the SDGs, again, is that actually they embed the assumptions of neoliberal governance, of private capital, of markets operating within everything that we do. So we ideologically don't even recognize the politics that's there once something is rendered technical. We no longer talk about the political dimensions within the work. So I'm just going to talk about three elements of this that we see coming up across things like discourse on sustainable agricultural intensification, particularly when we're talking with more technical audiences. Now, as a social scientist and anthropologist, I now do most of my work is with engineers and civil engineers, particularly around how what might be sort of technical water or sanitation systems are deeply and intensely political. And thinking about how that sort of interdisciplinary knowledge can help to try and unpick. I'm not going to use solve, because I think very often we use the word solution where the solutions are very, very far away. And perhaps that's also part of our trying to get money to fund what we're doing, is that we're sometimes offering false solutions for things. But I want to talk about three elements of what we end up doing, or traps that we fall into when we talk about inclusivity in this sort of deeply apolitical way. First off, we're starting to create lots and lots of policy that looks like we're addressing inclusivity, but actually doesn't do it at all. And what we see is that it's very easy to write things like gender and youth into policy and into our reports. Very often we're just, particularly recognising women, create women's groups, putting women in leadership, etc., etc. We'll create some initiatives for youth to participate and so on. It looks like we've done something. And I think this is one of our problems in when we think about this science-policy interface, is that we really only think about policy. If we only think about policy, we're never thinking about implementation, because policy is too easy to create. So most of these reports and you know, the policies that we see coming out tend to rely on these very simplistic ideas about inclusion, about the women in leadership, for example. And if we look at the SDG 5 on gender, it has very simple measures where you're really counting women. You're not really differentiating in any intersectoral, class-based way about different types of, you know, positionality of woman. You're thinking about gender as in actual biological sex, in this case, really, as being the determining factor for how things operate. And what that has led into, particularly in gender and agricultural research, is very poor research, actually, that has got sex disaggregated survey work that has been then taken to be a truth about gender and agriculture. So there's a lot of really good work by Cheryl Doss, Ruth Meinson Dick, have written a lot about these myths that are constructed from actually the data that we've been very busy collecting, where we've gone and done sex disaggregated survey. The problem with that is, of course, women and men are not separate populations as if they were separate species. They live together in households, in spaces, and households that, by the way, of course, look very different in different parts of the world. But when we go within a survey, we're assuming types of social organisation, we're assuming questions that make sense. And we know that actually people perform to surveys. They give answers very often that are what they assume the questioner wants to hear, or the survey is very boring and they want to get it done and filled in and gone. So we know that the data is pretty weak, okay? But what then happens into policy, and this paper by a PhD student of mine, I published with my colleague Susanna Salu, Ruth Smith did an analysis of climate-smart agricultural policy in Tanzania, and she was using this representation called what's the problem represented to be? So she wanted to look at all different types of policies across climate-smart agriculture, livestock policies, the water policies, and so on, and how they represented gender. And so this paper of hers sets out what gender mainstreaming has done. Now, you know, she does a very nice, sophisticated analysis. She finds 5 different ways that gender is used and so on. But really, the overall headline of this research is that what tends to happen is this thing we call isomorphic mimicry. And that's, you know, lots of scientists in here from biological mimicry. That this is a policy that pretends to have capability. It looks like it's inclusive, but actually it has no capacity. There is no implementation plan. There is no strategy to actually do it. And it relies on very, very weak assumptions and stereotypes. So rather than using this nuanced science, the complex research about how actually existing agricultural livelihoods are in a country, it makes assumptions. And why does it do that? It makes sense for a Tanzanian policymaker in that space. They don't need to think about what's really going on in the country, because that's not who their audience is. The audience is the external donor audience. So you repeat the words that that audience wants to meet. So it looks like we've got the window dressing. So we've just got to copy and paste. Another paper in the same PhD by publication looks at how neoliberal ideologies are embedded in then how we think about inclusion. And so what Ruth went then next to look at after she'd done her policy analysis was to look at the Women's Empowerment Index in Agriculture. I'm sure some of you in this space have come across that. There's a whole industry around this weigher, the pro-weighers, the other weighers, there's every different bit has now developed some new index. And I think I was glad Marta brought up this issue of indexes. I spend a lot of time now picking apart indexes and indicators. What does this indicator represent? What are we simplifying in this number and this metric that we've created? But more than that, what does this metric, even if this metric is complete nonsense, metrics still have power to drive agendas, to drive activities and action, to use up people's time and resources. So when we investigated this use of the WEA, the Women's Empowerment Index in Agriculture, we were working with Care USA and looking at some of their projects that had tried to implement this index. And we were doing a power analysis in the sense of seeing, well, whose agendas and whose assumptions were embedded in how this thing called empowerment was being measured, but also in the decisions that the projects took. And then we wanted to know, and how relevant was this? Who was it actually for? Because I think this isn't asked often enough. When we're very busy in the business of creating the indexes, of collecting the data to measure the indexes, who is it for? And what became clear in this sort of index creation was, and I have a picture of Bill here because, of course, Bill was funding a lot of this. It was probably Melinda because she was more interested in gender. So the Gates Foundation are very much promoting these sorts of empowerment indexes because there's an assumption, this sort of neoliberal governance assumption of quantification. You can quantify the complex and contested idea because empowerment is not something that we agree on. It's a word we can say, but your empowerment's different to your empowerment, to my empowerment. And this is what we found in doing this work, that actually the things that are being measured in the WEA tend to have been based on what's quite a sort of, I'm being a bit rude to Americans, but a sort of autonomous individual who is empowered. So a lot of the questions in a survey to measure empowerment are around how free are you to make decisions, yeah? Without your husband or those sorts of things. Again, they're embedded assumptions within those about what a household should look like, about what an empowered individual should look like. In focus group discussions, I think particularly in Malawi, what came out was that actually what local people wanted was a definition of empowerment that recognised the collectivity a great deal more. As someone married into a Tanzanian village, I've come to recognise the strength in this sort of collective empowerment that comes from family rather than this autonomous individual. So I think we've got to be very careful in these sorts of words when we're talking participation empowerment, that we're not embedding cultural values that are very often quite American because of the money that funds them. So who are these tools actually for? And the other thing is, once you make these sorts of indexes, this thing, the WEA, has become so complicated, who is it really for? And the answer in this research was it was just for the Gates Foundation. It didn't really change anything in implementation because a local government couldn't really use this thing. Collecting the data on these things is hugely expensive. And that's where I'll come to in sort of my final bits before I'll sort of think about wrapping up. So I think when Hyun invited me, he'd found this paper that we'd produced around sustainable intensification. So our title ended up with Neither Sustainable Nor Inclusive, a Political Economy of Agricultural Policy and Livelihoods in Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia. I think, Leo, you were involved in some of the bigger program, that this was a piece of consultancy that I did for Lund University to look at the sort of long-term trajectories of the political economy of agriculture in Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia. Tanzania I've worked in for a very long time, Malawi and Zambia much less. But we built on big literature review with experts in those countries, a lot of key informant interviewing, going out to the villages, the local agricultural extension offices, and really thinking about what was actually happening in agriculture in terms of the dynamics. Where did these dynamics come from? How did this relate to the colonial history and the immediate post-colonial history? And where did this inclusivity fit within that? Who was being included? Who was being excluded in these sort of longer-term dynamics? And how did this relate then to these sort of discourses on sustainable agricultural intensification being funded like people like DFID at that time? Particularly in Malawi, because Malawi is such a small country, and agriculture is having to intensify because of the way the population is, the plot sizes are very small, and so on. It has a very, very intensive relationship with donors in all sorts of ways, which is more so than in Tanzania and different to Zambia. And again, to me, this is very much that this paper showed that we couldn't generalize for East Africa, for Southern Africa, for Africa. And I think there's a tendency to do that very much when we're thinking about these sort of dynamics of agriculture. And even within somewhere like Tanzania, I've been part of fabulous book project edited by Dan Brockington and Christine Noy, which took various anthropologists and people who'd done surveys 30 years ago in our PhDs and took us back to resurvey places and to try and understand what had happened over the long term. And what it really showed was that you couldn't generalize in Tanzania either. You know, every place had these sort of different trajectories. Some were getting richer, some were getting poorer, some were getting more inclusive, some were getting more exclusive, some were changing because of intensification, some were changing because of extensification. Commonly, governments have such little capacity to actually affect changes. And I think this is the big thing. When we start talking about we should do this, who are we thinking of as we? Sometimes we're thinking of we as the human race, we as scientists, we as development actors. But who are the we's in this case when we're wanting to get this transformation? Who's to take action? So we can come up with the nice policies, but if we want to do intensification, say through adopting agroecological methods or human rights-based approaches, where is the capacity and the political willingness to take those things on? In all of these countries, what we see instead is very much aid-driven top-level policy discourse. So we see very weak policies with very little implementation capacity. We see where you have got big state-led agricultural interactions are often through things like subsidy schemes. But subsidy schemes are deeply politicized and embedded in vote winning and there are all sorts of other underlying dynamics in those things. But unifying all of this is very, very weak state capability. You can have an extension officer, but if they don't have a motorbike, they can't go out and do anything in terms of interactions. We also had this feeling was that this aid system, and this is a quote from an interviewee in Malawi, who said, aid is weakening everybody. We need to kick out the donors. There's so little capacity to implement the policies that are designed by them. In the end, districts just rely on NGOs to do anything. And to me, this is one of the biggest things is that we have to address. The we, as in the we of this room, is that actually we're probably part of the problem in bringing too many policies, too many reforms, too many ideas for very weak systems that cannot absorb them. And they also take responsibility away from government. You see this endlessly in the types of sort of interventions and decentralization interventions that actually remove responsibility from central government. Well, the NGOs are going to do that. A donor's going to come in and fund this bit of activity, particularly around these sort of inclusive, the social inclusive types of things. And the trajectory actually is that what is happening in agriculture is very, very different to the fantasy ideas that we're talking about in spaces like this. When we're talking about inclusivity, what's actually happening is land differentiation, accumulation by dispossession, a dynamic that actually is making agriculture much less inclusive and much less equitable. And simply then talking about women or women's groups, in the case of Tanzania, what does including women mean? It means a district sets aside 5% of its very, very small budget to fund women's groups. Which women's groups are going to get funded? Well, probably the ones who know the district chairman, that's his wife and her group. And what will they do? Maybe they'll have another chicken project. I don't know, but these things become, we've window dressed it in a very, very small way with a tiny little budget, but actually we really haven't talked about the power differentials that are going on. And we don't talk about the power differentials that are going on because what's happening is that we've got a lot of elite capture. The big politicians may be the ones buying up the land or re-diverting the rivers and accumulating the water. They may be there's all sorts of power actors going on in this space. But if we only focus on gender, then we don't need to talk about the real power dimensions that are going on. We have a great deal of private capital accumulation and this very, very low state capability. Now, one of the things in neoliberal governance is that we're often told that governments should be regulators, so environmental legislation, so on, that governments need to then regulate. Now, the space that I work in a lot in water and water allocations, essentially governments are only selling permits. There's no capacity to go and actually regulate water use, which means that then more powerful actors can use as much water as they want to use. So I think we really have to start talking about really what's going on in these spaces, going beyond having very simplified questionnaires with these mythical households. Because what we've done is we're part of the machine that creates this gap, that renders technical, this imaginary idea that we have this sort of fantasy space where we'll come up with policies and then policies will be implemented. We've promoted this incentive for isomorphic mimicry, that we just copy and paste these policies. We'll take a good practice that worked in Tanzania and take it to Zambia, and it must work in that context. We've created a tremendous amount of fantasy planning. And now I'm doing a lot more work in urban spaces and around climate adaptation. And there's some really interesting work coming out of India that talks about cities creating fantasy plans for climate adaptation. Because this adapting to this thing that's coming down the line is so uncertain and so unknown in cities that are changing in ways that are also unknown in terms of population demographics, and that actually, let's face it, no one is in control of. So what you do as a government or a city authority is you can signal more control than you have by producing a plan. This is our plan for control over this space. It looks like we have an idea, where actually there's no capacity or capability or political willingness actually to implement that. The same would go, and I think Marta to talk about, is the sort of human rights level. So looking at things like human rights to water and sanitation as mechanisms for inclusivity. Those can work to a certain degree, but only where you have political willingness. One of the countries that we see that has had a lot of political willingness is South Africa on that, but people are actually starting to talk about the human right and the minimum standard for access to water as now being a regressive thing that actually becomes a standard for poor people and holds people in poverty, which is interesting because I used to very much promote that human right. So seeing that human right to sanitation, for example, Kenya has that in a constitution. It means absolutely nothing politically. So a human right can be there in our policy, but without the political willingness to fight for that human right, for the implementation of it, it actually means nothing at all. We frame so much of our action in fuzzy words and contested concepts, so in very reductive thinking and this rendering technical. And I am now renowned with my PhD students for saying, what do you mean by community? When you bring this word community, who is it you're talking about? What power structure, what institution are you actually talking about here? Don't talk about this unified, local, romanticized thing, because that doesn't really exist. What do you mean by empowerment? What do you mean by justice, and justice for who? What is fairness and what is equity? Because these are all political contested concepts, and they require political negotiation. Now, sometimes it's nice, I think we could get around the politics and just get to the delivery, that we just implement. But that's why we're in this mess now, because we're pretending that we're doing so many things. Our COPs, our SDGs, they're a form of pretense that actually we're trying to solve some of these long-term trajectories, and it makes us feel better when we come to meetings and talk about them. But actually out there, because the gap between what we talk about at this fantasy level and what's really happening on the ground is so large, we're still just talking a pretense level amongst ourselves. So these are all normative concepts, and they've become codified into managerial indicators to be managed and to hide the operations and assumptions of neoliberal governance, because each of these is actually about power. So in conclusion, I like this elephant diagram. It's the sort of the wicked, complex problems that we deal with around agricultural transformation or those sort of big water security issues that I look at are very much like elephants, and in a sense that they're enormous things that are difficult to describe by one person. This is the analogy is also if blind people were feeling an elephant, how would you describe it if you were just feeling the trunk or the tail? And as different disciplines, we're often describing different parts of the problem. And we're still not very good at putting all the components together to really describe the fundamental nature of this whole problem. And in a sense then, as social science, we're often very cross when people talk about interdisciplinary approaches, but you bring in a social scientist, but really you just want them to add the women or add the youth, add some participatory groups without thinking through power. Because those adding as a form of inclusion are based on these really simplistic myths and are actually really detrimental to actually inclusive, sustainable intensification, because that's going to require a great deal more in terms of honest conversations about the dynamics of how agriculture is changing. We need to try not to be too complicit then in this rendering technical and talking about real incentives on the ground and how power flows and our role in that as international researchers, because the ways we're funding and the type of language that we get funded through, UKRI, for example, is very guilty of pushing a lot of these sorts of simplifications about local community, about empowerment and so on. We need to work with and from actually existing governance, not imaginary fantasy, what we'd wish for governance, and so that we can avoid some of this copy and paste performative policy declarations and fantasy plans. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think you should still be on stage for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Phil.
I honestly feel like giving up. Should I? Is there any point? I mean, it would be great if you could leave us with something slightly more positive than this message, because that is actually what I feel like doing now. Because all the stuff I've done all my life has just been, framed by imaginary kind of concepts, overarching strategies, and even deconstructing the words that we use to describe what we do. It's really difficult, and we're doing the best we can. But it seems as if everything we've been doing and continue to do is a waste of time.
Well, personally, that's sort of how I feel, and I've also been in this business for 20-something years now. And I think it's because we won't have some of these... we do have to have some of these honest conversations about our own positionalities in some of this. And it's often students that have been pushing some of these debates. We have very radical engineering students in Leeds at the moment who are really very into their decolonising. And they're pushing these conversations very hard. And I think the positive is having the honest conversations, because actually these are the conversations that I've had in the villages, in the district offices, because they're really what's going on. And I think a lot of the people who we'd call policymakers are deeply frustrated by having to pretend in the pretending spaces. And I'm sorry that it doesn't sound like a positive message, but we have to stop kidding ourselves that doing the same things again and again and again is solving these issues, because it isn't. I know that's not...
You had a question?
Yeah, almost the same, because I was looking at, if you talk of inclusion of women and youth, and you want us to be more practical, I thought that there will be a slide that will give us the other statements of what we should be doing.
But you see, the very point of this is that it is not for this room to be saying what should happen, because we don't know the capacity of any particular place. If you're thinking of a district government or a village council, what can they do in their particular place? So to leave you with a more positive, so something I do work from is problem-driven iterative adaptation, which is coming out of Harvard. It was part of the Doing Development Differently push that ODI were also involved in, the politics and governance work stream. I was at ODI. And that's around local problem analysis. And I've done this myself with a local governance indicators project in Tanzania. Bring the local stakeholders together, talk about what the problem is you want to address, but in a way that relates exactly to existing capability to address that with the staff that you've got already. Yeah? So it's about a real frame of analysis based on the resources that you have and doing that in an experimental learning way. But part of that is also about having an authorizing environment to be able to do that as well at the same time. I mean, if you're interested in that, this PDIA approach is a really good thing to look at.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, so we should continue. Thanks again. I think that set the stage for this morning's session. And at the end of the session, we will hopefully have a little bit more time to discuss about these things. So if there are any remaining questions or comments to be made, then that is the place to do it. Now I would like to proceed with our next speaker. That is Leo Zulu from Malawi. He is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment and Spatial Science at Michigan State University in the US. He's a broadly trained human geographer with a PhD from the University of Illinois and nearly 35 years of international professional experience in natural resources management and biodiversity conservation. His focus is mainly on Southern Africa, employing an interdisciplinary approach that integrates his natural and social sciences background. And his recent publications encompass gender and youth-inclusive sustainable agricultural intensification. He co-edited a book titled Africa in the Post-2015 Development Agenda, a Geographical Perspective. And today he will be talking about empowering agriculture, nurturing social, gender and youth equity in sustainable intensification in sub-Saharan Africa. Leo, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the invite to be here and for all the exciting talks that we have already listened to. And the presentations before, the two presentations before me have really set me up well for what I'm going to talk about. So I'm looking at trying to get down in the weeds. So in terms of measuring equity and contextualizing indicators that are out there about equity and inclusion. And then we'll also talk about some tools that are out there in terms of decision making. So I'm targeting decision makers on the ground, people on the ground that make decisions. How can we equip them to help them make these decisions to include gender and inclusiveness? And we also look at understanding gender-biased land tenure system. We use land tenure because land is like the largest resource that you have in agriculture. So we use land tenure and how it is gendered to understand the context within which we are operating with these indicators and how that operates through land access. And then looking at inclusion of youth in sustainable agriculture intensification, but also looking at conceptualization of the youth. How does that influence how does that have material impacts on inclusive sustainable intensification, some of the barriers and some of the strengths. It's particularly important now because this is like the largest dynamic that's happening on the African continent in terms of youth and the youth bulge and interrelated problems of unemployment and underemployment. At the same time, we have challenges with food systems and food security. Maybe at some point there's a place where you can merge the two and find interlinked solutions as we are moving forward. And I conclude as we go. I'm not going to talk about all the problems and why we need solutions, so I will just go ahead and skip that part. So I'm looking at gender gaps in terms of sustainable intensification. So if you look at, so there are gender gaps in productivity, in terms of food insecurity and land tenure and access. This is just a map showing from the lighter blue to the higher, to the darker blues, the percentage of people that are, the share of women that have land security and land tenure. And you see that a lot of these countries are much lower than 50% of them. And then if you are looking at moderate to severe food insecurity, so you have a difference between men and women. Women have higher levels of insecurity. So, and then if you are looking at gender gaps in terms of agricultural productivity, we talked about Malawi here as well. So Malawi has the highest gender gap between men and women in terms of productivity is as high as 28%, but a lot of these are 10 to 16%. And then also, but then the impact, the potential impact of filling these gaps is these kinds of graphs that show that what would happen if these gaps were filled. So there is a projected increase in $1 trillion looking at the underdeveloped world, 1% in GDP if you fill these gaps. And in terms of people that are undernourished, people who are lifted out of poverty, 2% improvement. So we can see the importance of trying to fill these gender gaps. And so there will be millions and millions of people that are brought out of poverty. And then so looking here, some of the benefits and burdens, the big thing about sustainable agriculture intensification is how there aren't really very practical tools for assessing inequity in access and in detecting these disparities. So this is the focus of a study that we did in Ghana and Malawi, looking at these disparities. There are all these dimensions we've looked at and equity concern. I have included one myth of my own here, 70% of women, yeah, Anna. Gotta include one myth. But and then if you look at livelihoods as well, so there's balances in livelihoods, in all these inequities. And in terms of unemployment of the youth, that's an important component. The youth, and it's both unemployment and underemployment that we have to look at in terms of the youth. So all these linkages, and there are larger, more complex linkages between SDGs and the challenges of inclusive, non-inclusive, sustainable agriculture intensification. But we are really interested in the decision makers, the people who are making decisions on the ground. And I have worked in agriculture and forestry extension as well, and I found that a lot of the creativity happens on the ground. The frontline extension workers who have to make decisions on a day-by-day basis to make things work on the ground under very challenging situations. So that's where we are targeted at, sustainable, effective tools to equip these decision makers in order to push inclusive agriculture forward. So there's this project, one of NRI's earlier projects, the SAILA, and we were part of this project funded by this group. And so this was intensification research and agriculture. And what we were trying to do, finding more equitable process for sustainable agriculture for inclusion of men and women. How can we achieve this process? And looking at this, and the second objective, what are the tools and metrics that we can use to make agriculture more sustainable and more equitable, and especially how tools that decision makers can use. So detecting gender and youth inequity is an important component. If you can't detect it, then how do you know what the potential entry points for solutions would be? And then we're also looking at the indicators themselves. We have seen the problems, very generic indicators, but can you customize these indicators so they mean something locally, and then they are relevant, and then they're actionable as you move forward. And then we're also moving in, what is the benefit of customizing of these indicators to the local level? And then moving on, so I'm not gonna go through all this, it's just trying to show at the bottom where we are headed is here, enhance gender and youth equity in SAI. But just the kind of things that we did in the project. So going into the literature and identifying all these indicators and tools for gender and youth equity, and then contextualizing them, refining, and even adapting them. What we found is that very little is available in terms of youth, in terms of analyzing youth equity. So in the end, we had to adapt. Some of the gender tools includes youth. So this is a process of contextualizing, refining, and customizing. Then after that, we tested some of these tools on the ground with decision makers, and Malawi and Ghana is where we did this. And then we try to understand the context better by looking at land access, inequitable land access, and how these dynamics that we are looking at, how they manifest through the inequitable land access. And then we also did training for the decision makers through workshops on how to use these tools on the ground. So this is some of the work that come out of this. But the big output out of this is the decision makers guide that we have produced on the tools that decision makers can use to make agriculture more sustainable. And I'll kind of just introduce it a little more, but there's some articles we looked at, these contextualizing the indicators, and then we've looked at the youth articles, conceptualization as well as tools for youth analysis. And then we also looked at agriculture and sustainable intensification. So this is some of the works that we're going to talk about. So measuring equity and contextualizing indicators. So part of the process we looked at a process looking at 5 African countries, surveyed experts, local NGOs, and people that do sustainable agriculture intensification, and came up with lots of tools that are available in the literature as well. But what we found is that a lot of the tools for indicator sustainable intensification were really mainly 5 categories. There was social, economic, productivity, environment, and human. And we know how the productivity ones dominate in terms of what we are looking at. So what we wanted to do is to expand the social component, understand it better, and especially with the gender and the youth inequity. So that's what we are focusing on. Part of the advantage of doing this is an example where we did in Ghana, is we want to be able to say, if we have like one system of intensification, let's say system A, and then we have system B, we want to be able, in this spider diagram, to be able to say, okay, maybe system A works better for inclusion than system B on the different measures, productivity, environmental, and human, and economic, right? So, and then we're also trying to look at different scales from the field and the farm and moving forward. So some of the key challenges of generalized and impractical, these are theoretical indicators on the ground and very limited local relevance. So we're trying to get at this problem, finding these and customizing these indicators. So what we are looking at is also, so we adopted a gender transformative approach to gender inclusion. This is a Kabir, and the argument is that what's happening on the ground, looking at all the spaces where major decisions are made about decisions that affect inclusion or exclusion. So we're looking at the household level, community, market level, and government. But the key thing is that at each of those levels, there are written and unwritten rules that influence what actually happens on the ground. So, and norms and beliefs. So you really have to understand those rules and written rules and preconditions in order to really transform these relationships and change what's actually happening on the ground. So one change in one domain, it has to be supported with changes in other domains. You can't just change one little thing here and expect major change and transformation as you're moving forward. So this is just how it pans out, and then there are these major pockets of empowerment that Kabir talks about is access to resources, the capacity to be able, once you have the resources, to make something out of them, and then the agency that's there, decision-making, strategies and skills, and then achievements as well. So this is where you're measuring yields and health and food security and all that. So it's these relationships happening at the household, community, at the kin level and political level. So this is a kind of model that you're looking at and kind of drilling down on at the ground level. So just to show Ghana and Malawi and 2 districts in Malawi, 3 districts in Ghana, looking at matrilineal land systems and patrilineal land systems is a main dividing difference. And so this is what we did the work. And so looking at some of the challenges, these are some of the patterns that are coming out as we're drilling into the research. So this inequitable participation in decision-making is a really huge problem. So we go to the household, who makes this decision? Who includes this? And who chooses the crops? Who makes the decision to choose the crops? Well, when you're harvesting, who makes the decisions to market? And those kinds of things is where we are trying to drill and potentially influencing. So gender norms reinforcing inequities is a lot of what we are finding. And in matrilineal contexts where the husband goes and marries into the woman's village and lives there, but land is actually inherited down the woman's side. The men do not have a lot of land security there. Patrilineal society, the wife moves into a husband's village, land comes down the man's side, and the men have a lot of control, not just on the land, but on a lot of resources. So some women, though, finding lots of agencies, so lots of women negotiating access to intra-household land resources. So this is my own patch of land. You leave it to me, I will grow it, and I will sell for commercial purposes. And the money that I get from there is my money. I will do with it whatever I want to do. So you find those kinds of negotiations that are happening, or they will borrow land, or they will rent land in order for those kinds of things to happen. So these are the kinds of things we want to encourage from the household level as you're moving up. So, and then this negotiation is really important in terms of decision-making powers, joint decision-making powers as people are moving forward. So this is just to demonstrate how we contextualize those indicators, or those lists of indicators. So we're looking at each one of them. Is it relevant? What could it be used at? And we went to the villages and communities. Does this indicator make sense? What about the periodicity of the indicator? Does it make sense to ask a farmer how much they produced 3 months ago? What is a reasonable time for farmers to actually remember what they did? And so when they provide information, it's actually useful. So that is the kinds of levels of customization that we were talking about. So we found that we call this participatory indicator development. We drill down with the indicators to make them relevant. So it enhanced the indicators and the data collection processes for local relevance, which is where the key decisions have to be made. And we also found lots of practical insights from there in terms of what kinds of questions, if you wanted to find information about point A, what kinds of questions make sense? Who would you ask? And in the household or where? And how would you ask the question if it was a sensitive question about land, for instance? So those are the kinds of things that we were getting at in terms of level of detail. So, and another important thing that comes at this intersectionality between gender analysis and youth is an important part. So now we're not just looking at women and men, but we're looking at adult women and young women, distinguishing and adult men and young men and what the impacts would be. So, and then moving on to these tools for data collection, this is where then what we are interested in is this tool so you can anticipate the social impacts of sustainable intensification, and then you can move on how to adapt to these interventions, and then you can monitor over time how you are doing, but also then you can also evaluate projects in terms of how they are doing comparing activities or interventions as you are moving forward. So tested lots of tools, and these are the basis for which we tested the tools: affordability, timely collection of data, feasibility, potential for ex-ante assessment, domains of institutional analysis or that are most applicable, looking at equity indicator categories where it's relevant, and then the role for gender transformation indoors, and grouping those tools that assess gender differentiated risk of increase in labor. If you introduce an SAI intervention,
are you going to just overburden women with that? And then who benefits from it? Who is going to take that? Tools assessing gender differentiated access and the use of agricultural resources. So there was a set of tools there. And tools assessing equity and impacts of changes in technologies. You bring technologies, what are the impacts of that and what does that mean? And so in terms of decision-making tools, there are lots of findings that we are looking there. We found that the tools in terms of bringing intergenerational equity as well as understanding gender disparities were really complex at those levels, but then we were able to kind of drill down at the local level what they actually mean. And then proper use of these tools, it can fill in some of these gaps that we are talking about, because you have people that are making decisions. And in our workshops, we found a lack of awareness of tools that are there to actually help decision makers to understand what's happening on the ground. And then we did a pre and post training analysis to see what tools they knew, what knowledge levels they have, and after the training, what they understood and where they were heading at. So it looked like they are really understanding and they can move forward and use these tools. One of the things is like a gender balance tree that integrates youth. So we're looking at the trunk of a tree is an example of that. Looking at the trunk of the tree as members of a household, and the roots, what they put in there, what they do, what do men do, young women and adults in the household, right? And what decisions do they make? And these are the benefits. Who makes decisions about outputs in this and that? And who benefits, who gets income? And so you do an analysis before and you see an unbalanced tree, and then you move to the other end with strategies and how you can balance that tree. And these are other tools as well. So looking at participatory mapping and outputs, and again, bringing in communities. And in terms of the detail of the guide, we have instructions about the field work, how you can do this, how you can process it, where you can do the resources, how long it will take, and all those kinds of things. Looking at the youth and land responsiveness and criteria too, and again, a similar thing in terms of access of resources to land among the youth. What are the challenges? What are the strengths? So the guide kind of takes you through that as well. In terms of understanding gender-based systems, kind of in understanding this interaction between land access and gender, and then identifying the potential entry points. And then exploring the influence of cultural institutions and strengths in terms of moving forward. I will use this diagram because it ties down a lot of what we are talking about, this model here. This is where a lot of the control is happening, arenas of interaction, land, labor, crops, and benefits. But the main things that we are talking about is systems and norms that end, and then the land institutions at this point. And then we have the processes of translation and the cultural institutions here, SAI, technical, and all that. What we were finding is that a lot of these processes of translation of policy into practice are major part of the problem as well, in order to affect change. So we have to do change processes here, and then you have matrilineal, equal land rights on the right-hand side, influencing at the household, community, and market level, and you have to pick interventions in order to make change. So this is the kinds of work that we did. Institutional analysis, what they reviewed, looking at cross-level, just as an example. In a matrilineal society, men are land insecure. So commercialization and monetization of land is becoming more increasing in those areas. So you're linking at the household level of land insecurity, moving on to the market, where they're going out of the household to the market in order to find access to land. And then you have similar dynamics that are happening in terms of tenure security. So some of the key things then, institutional bias, neglecting these gender preconditions and processes and outcomes. These translation processes that we as experts, and I know when I used to work in development, we used to ask, who is an expert? So an expert is a guy from out of town, right? Who comes and tries to solve your problem. And then projects adopting gender transformative approach, they show promise for more equitable outcomes. And there are details in some of those publications if people want to look at those. And then growing agricultural and land scarcity, increasing pressures on these challenges that we are looking at, but also heightening the need then for equity in looking at SAI. So in terms of looking at the community, what did they think the entry points are? So we have a whole bunch of things there where the communities told us we can intervene there. So separating land plots for women where possible, mechanisms for fair allocation of land and benefits, inclusive decision making, leveraging the community level as an entry point. You can go up and you can go down, but in terms of our cultures, it's an important level there. And forging coalitions was an important part. And I'll just finish up. Maybe that's just examples of the guidebook here, the tools that we looked at, a set of 10 tools and lots of conditions and what you can do with the youth. And then I'll just do the youth again. It's a similar power relationships here, and conceptualization of the youth is important. Two main definitions of the youth. One is the youth as human capital, which is important. Youth as labor, youth in capacity, and then the creativity of the youth and all that. But there's also a conceptualization of youth as transition. It's a temporariness. Like youthhood is just a hoarding place. You're just passing through it. Why should we bother give you resources and know that when you're going to just passing through and you become an adult? When you combine these two conceptualization, you find that you're keeping the youth stranded in the same place. So if you can highlight this more, recognize the contributions of the youth more, technology, creativity, and agriculture, food systems, solving unemployment problems, maybe that's where we're gonna find some solutions. So just in terms of research, moving forward, this is some of the guidebook here, and in terms of research, then as we are moving forward, we are really interested in developing some more, working some more on investigating these uneven impacts of sustainable intensification, because there's still more work that's needed. And also looking at testing more indicators and how good and sustainable they are and how important they are relevant at a local level. And then an excellent and huge opportunity is this intersectionality between gender and youth. Lots of interest in the youth now. It's also an important entry point for sustainable intensification to be addressing two problems at the same time. And then, of course, the effective policies, and then really going from theory to practice and trying what can you do, what tools do you have, how does it help you to make decisions as we are moving forward. And we thought that local decision makers in agriculture, extension workers, people managing projects are really an important entry point for us. So I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leo. There's a tiny bit of room for one question. Yes, please. A mic, please.
Hello.
That's the team, that's our team at the end, so I should acknowledge it's a big team effort. Yeah.
Still presenting?
Okay, there's also a question there. I didn't see you. Please go ahead.
Okay,
Two
thank
questions
you.
then.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. I've listened to you, and you talked about youths, and one indicator that hasn't come out is about interest and passion in various things that youths can do. Because not every youth wants a piece of land. Not every youth wants to produce. There are quite a number of other things that youth can do along the transformation pathway of what you are trying to say. So how many would want to have land, and how many would want to do just marketing of what is being produced, and how many would want to do something else? in the transformation process. So is that something that needs assessment of what youths could do in this transformation process? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Should I wait or go? Yeah. So then the question of the youth is really important. A lot of it is part of the concept, how we conceive the youth to be. And also part of it is how the youth conceive of themselves. And part of it is also our education system. It's almost like, in some ways, it's a kind of a colonial type of education where you're educating people to be in white-collar jobs. Agriculture didn't seem very important. So a lot of the young people and parents think that if you're going to college, you're going to university, you're not going to be in agriculture. You're going to leave your village and go into the city and work there. And so that's part of changing that mentality as well is important. So part of it is, so there's projects in Kenya, for instance. You have young men going as models. They're making farming sexy. They are on their phone. They are on social media, going to their farm. And agri-food systems is an opportunity, technology, and they understand better creativity in terms of agriculture. So it's across the value chain, where are the youth's strengths? Where can they contribute best is the way to do it. But like I said, you really have to start changing lots of things across the way at the community level, at the government level. But part of it is just our education system. Why should our education system be meant to just produce people that work in the office? And then we have huge food security challenges. So there's a transformation that needs to be done there. Man, I hope that answers it. It's a major question. Lots of youth don't want to work in the field, but there's also ways that they can engage in more youth-appropriate ways.
One more short question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, it was very interesting on the whole yesterday and today. Leo, you've talked about very good, point and concerns. And my question is very much related to the question asked before. Yeah. The concern in Ethiopia, for instance, the youth is living out from agriculture. And nowadays they are not at all interested, to do agriculture, and they're moving to urban areas and looking for urban lifestyle. And did you consider those issues in your model?
Yeah. So we considered those issues, trying to understand them, what's happening on the ground. But what was coming out is that, I'll give you the case of Malawi, right? There are lots of people that went to college and they can't get jobs for 4 or 5 years. So at some point, it's need because it's gonna meet, demand. It's like, okay, maybe I didn't really want to be in agriculture. Maybe I can start with, agro-marketing, right? Or entrepreneurship in agriculture. But you have to start from somewhere. So looking at this problem that's there, huge youth unemployment and underemployment. At the same time, we have agriculture and we want to modernize food systems. And there are lots of ways to do that using technology, and that are the ways that the youth can do it. Then you have to start slowly, starting from somewhere. Entrepreneurship is really an important entry point, and use of technologies and getting to young people that way. And then those examples where you use models, the youth that are models, they have to be proud about their culture, who they are, and what their identity is another component of that as well. So I think it's a process, and over time, but you gotta start entry points and trying to fix problems as you're moving forward.
Thank you very much, Leo.
Yeah, thank you.
We have to move on. But there will be, I hope if I manage the time well today, there will be some time still at the end of this session to dig a little deeper into those questions. So now we will have a range of speakers from the Natural Resources Institute. We will start with Truly Santika. Truly Santika is a senior fellow in biostatistics for food and agriculture at the Natural Resources Institute. She's an expert in geospatial analysis and environmental change analysis for the management of forests, livelihoods, biodiversity, and natural resources. In addition to teaching, she's also heading the UKRI ESRC-funded study that looks into the ways that forest protection, agricultural growth, and market access all affect food security in tropical environments. And she's presently working on a Horizon Europe project in Africa and Latin America, and she is also the associate editor, an associate editor of the People and Nature journal. And today she will be talking about spatial landscape analysis for understanding the dynamics and multi-aspects of sustainable agriculture. Truly?
Thank you, everybody. So thank you, Anna, for introducing me. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about spatial landscape analysis for understanding the dynamics and multiple aspects of sustainable agriculture. So I'm going to present some preliminary results of the research on landscape change assessment of different agriculture production in tropical countries, including focusing on Indonesia and Colombia. So the work on Indonesia is part of the project funded by the UKRI SRC grant, while the work on Colombia is funded by the Horizon Europe project. So yeah, I'm particularly grateful to the FaNSI program that has provided the seed funding for me to obtain further project grants and expand my research on this area. Okay, so first, okay, I will talk about the landscape change assessment in Indonesia, focusing on Kalimantan, the Indonesian part of the island of Borneo. So here we could see a figure of the change in primary agricultural sectors at the village level in the island between 2000 and 2020. So the data was based on government census. And we can see here that the primary sector in the island can be broadly classified into 4 categories. The subsistence production, and then we also have the agroforestry and polyculture, and monoculture, and other sectors. The subsistence productions, in this case, includes the shifting cultivations, as well as hunting and gathering of forest products. And then the agroforestry and polyculture sectors include the cultivation of mixed commodities in agroforestry system, such as the cocoa, coffee, rubber, coconut, and pepper. And then the monoculture sectors mainly include the cultivation of oak palm and timber trees, including the acacia and eucalyptus species. And other sectors include agriculture service and freshwater inland fishing. So as we can see here that over the past 20 years, subsistence villages become less common, nearly halved, whereas the agroforestry and polyculture and monoculture villages increased in prevalence, doubling the extent. Okay, so we can see here the matrix of agricultural system transition at the village level every 5 years between 2000 and 2020. So over this period, 70% of Kalimantan villages stayed in the same sector every 5 years, while the remaining villages moved to another sector. And then the likelihood of subsistence villages shifting to agroforestry or polyculture sector after 5 years is about 20%. And the likelihood of villages with agroforestry or polyculture system or other sectors shifting to subsistence production was likewise about 20%. So this indicates that the subsistence villages as well as villages with agroforestry or polyculture and other sectors have very dynamic livelihood strategies. Unlike the subsistence agroforestry and other sector villages, monoculture villages tend to stay in the same sector once they are established. Okay, so when we look at the social and biophysical characteristic of each of the agriculture production system, we can see quite a distinct feature associated with different production models. We can see that subsistence villages tend to be located in high altitude and remote area, on mineral soil, and have high rainfall. Agroforestry villages tend to be located in moderate altitude, have high rainfall, and good access to cities and roads. On the other hand, monoculture villages are mostly located in lowlands, have high rainfall and moderate access to cities or roads, and other sectors are mostly located in lowlands, very close to cities or roads, on peatland, and have fairly low rainfall. Okay, so utilizing recent forest cover data set derived from remote sensing, we are able to assess the dynamic forest loss and also regrowth across the island in the last 20 years. So the data that we use here advanced the conventional forest cover data, as it captures not only forest loss, but also forest regrowth, allowing following deforestation and or degradation. So in 1990, over 90% of Kalimantan areas are covered with forest. By 2020, forest extent was reduced to over 50%. And over the same period, the extent of degraded forest increased from 2% to 19%, and the extent of deforested land increased to 17%. All right, so by combining information on from the forest cover data sets from remote sensing and agriculture sector data from government census, we are able to see different patterns of forest loss and regrowth in different agriculture production systems dominantly occur at the village level. So we found that intact forest area is largest in subsistence and agroforestry or polyculture villages. We also found that degraded forest area is largest in agroforestry villages, but these villages also have the most extensive forest regrowth. And for monoculture villages, deforestation land was found to be most prevalent here, and forest growth is also limited. We combine data on the change in indicators of well-being with data on the change in agriculture sectors every 5 years between 2000 and 2020. We use a counterfactual impact evaluation method to analyze how the well-being have likely changed with respect to the changing agriculture production models in the villages. In terms of well-being, we look at environmental indicators such as water pollution incidence and severity, and then also air pollution level and flood prevalence. We also look at social indicators such as the prevalence of conflicts and child malnutrition rates. As for the socioeconomic indicators, we look at poverty rates, proportion of household with electricity, and then use of clean energy for cooking, and quality of sanitation. In terms of the change in village sectors, we focus on the change from less intensive to more intensive agricultural systems, including from subsistence production to agroforestry or polyculture system, as indicated by the blue bars, from subsistence production to monoculture sectors, as indicated by the orange bars, and the change from agroforestry or polyculture system to monoculture sectors, as indicated by the red bars. Okay, so our preliminary analysis shows that moving from subsistence production to agroforestry or polyculture system improved electricity rates and sanitation, but it also increased air pollution level. So the increase in air pollution is likely due to the fact that many polyculture systems in Borneo still use burning for clearing of land. We also found that moving from subsistence production to monoculture improved the use of clean energy for cooking, but not on other aspects. Furthermore, we also found that moving from agroforestry or polyculture to monoculture system improved clean energy use, but it also increased air pollution and conflict prevalence, as well as reduced housing with electricity. So the most probable reason for the increase in conflicts are land grabbing by large monoculture companies, and the likely reason for reduced access to electricity are influx of workers to fill the monoculture sectors, either supported by the government or spontaneous migration. And these workers usually have deprived living conditions. Okay, so the landscape, second landscape change assessment that I will cover briefly next is the change in crop production in Colombia. So here we focus on 4 important crops for the country, including oil palm, coffee, cocoa, and export banana. So the data were derived from the government census. So this figure shows the change in the distribution of the crops between 2005 and 2020. As we can see here that some crops such as oil palm and cocoa have expanded extensively over these periods. Coffee and banana for export appear to expand in some area, but in other areas the extent have reduced. So the government census data set provide important information at least on 2 aspects. First is the change in the total extent of the crops. And second is the extent of the crop cultivation in each municipality, which could indicate the degree of specialization or diversity of the municipality in terms of crop production. So for example, the figure here shows that oil palm has expanded by 27% every 5 years in Colombia. And the oil palm growing municipalities also tend to be specialized with nearly 5% of the land area dedicated to the crop. Unlike oil palm, and the extent of coffee has remained relatively the same in the last 15 years. And coffee growing municipalities tend to be highly specialized with 6% of the land area cultivated by the crop. As for cocoa, the cultivation area has expanded by 19%. Unlike oil palm and coffee growing municipalities, area dedicated to cocoa production in a municipality is relatively small on average, suggesting a more diversified crop production system. And finally, municipalities with export banana sectors are quite limited in size, but they tend to be highly specialized, with 5% of the municipality land area dedicated to the crop. All right, so that's the end of my presentations on the preliminary findings of my current research. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Truly. I will look around if there's any questions from the audience. We have a little bit of time. If not, then maybe I can ask a question myself. Do you know if there's still a lot of shifting cultivation being practiced in Borneo, like there used to be in Africa, but now more and more like farmers are moving away from shifting cultivation to a more permanent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's still some of the area in Borneo, especially near the upland. So they do shifting cultivation, and still persist. Of course, with the government now pushing towards more modernized agriculture, it started to reduce more and more, and it becomes a challenge for food security as well.
Okay. Any other questions? No, then I think we will move on to, thank you very much, Truly, and then we will move on to Rachel. Are you there? Yeah. The next speaker, I will move the slide. Next speaker is Rachel Chase. She is an American PhD student living in France. She has been a part-time PhD student at NRI for 4 years now, since 2020. And she's also a scientist working on high-value crops and previously on banana genetic resources at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SIAT. And today she will be talking about sustainable agricultural practices, ensets, and farmer-led drought-tolerant trait selection in southwest Ethiopia. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you just show me how this... that's the next, and that's the laser. Okay. And can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Iona and the organizers for including me in this fantastic event. As Jonas said, I'm a PhD student studying the drought tolerance of enset, which is an important food security crop in Ethiopia. And today I'd like to share with you some of the work on my second chapter, which is investigating farmer-led drought tolerance trait selection of enset. There we go. First, I'd like to touch on the importance of drought-tolerant crops. We all know about the projected risks of climate change, including higher temperatures and increased rainfall variability, has catalyzed research on drought-tolerant crops. And this is because by including drought-tolerant crops in sustainable agrosystems, we can create more resilient and ecologically balanced agriculture. We can even extend production to marginal lands that often have low food security. And we can gain insight from indigenous crop varieties and practices that have evolved in drought-prone regions. And a prime example of that is enset, also known as false banana or Abyssinian banana. It's a tall, herbaceous perennial, closely related to banana, but with lots of differences. The wild form occurs from Ethiopia down to South Africa, and the domestic land races are exclusively grown in southwest Ethiopia in rain-fed smallholder farms. So enset is harvested and processed by groups of women in local communities. It's hard work, but they do it with laughter and singing, and we're not sure if they feel empowered or not, but we can discuss that later. And as you can see, they use basic wooden tools to scrape the starchy pulp from the leaf sheaves of the plant, which they then put into leaf-lined garden pits, where it's left to ferment from several months to a year or more. And then the resulting product here is made into a flatbread called kocho, a porridge called bula, and then there's the unfermented underground corn that is boiled and eaten like potato. And nutrition-wise, enset is high in calories and some micronutrients, but is lacking in protein and other vitamins and nutrients, so it's usually complemented with other crops and meat as part of a healthy diet. So the whole plant is used. It's made into rope, building material, packaging, animal fodder, especially during the droughts, garden mulch, traditional medicine, and has high cultural value. And you can see here on the bottom right that it's often planted near homes to create an attractive and shaded area for families to gather. It's also known as the tree against hunger for its reputation in sustaining families through crop failures and famines, like the one that we know of in the 1980s. And that's because it's high yielding, it can be harvested any time, and the food products that I showed you have a very long shelf life. It currently supports more than 20 million people, or about 1/5 of the population of Ethiopia. And it's putatively tolerant to drought, although there's little scientific evidence of this, which is why my project is so important. So for my first chapter, I showed that the production of enset is variable across the growing zones, which you can see in the map on the left, and that farmers are growing more enset in drought-prone areas and after severe droughts. And that was published in 2022. And for my second chapter, I'm looking at the high phenotypic diversity of the hundreds of land races to find if there are any traits that contribute to drought tolerance. And here you can see some of the diversity of the color traits in the pseudostem and the whole plant. But there also is a lot of variation in size, leaf traits, and physiological traits, which I'll talk about now. I'll just take a little sip of water. So my first question was, which enset functional traits are correlated with aridity? And to answer this, I went to the field I sampled inset on 43 farms, shown here by the red dots, across an aridity index gradient going from low values, dry farms to wetter farms. And I did this in 3 different zones. And you can see on the top right an example of a wetter farm, a high aridity index, and then a drier farm at the bottom. You can see the differences there. And at each farm, I measured a suite of functional traits, including size, growth rate, leaf traits, including number, area, wax, and temperature, and stomatal traits, including area density and conductance. And then to determine which traits have significant correlations with aridity, I ran a mixed effects regression, and here you see the 5 traits that have significant relationship with the black lines, and we can zoom in on that. And this shows that leaf wax, leaf number, plant height rate, and leaf temperature differential, which is the difference between the temperature of the top and the bottom of the leaf, are higher in drier farms, and stomatal conductance is higher in wetter farms. And secondly, I wanted to know if farmers are choosing land races with drought-tolerant traits. And for this, I asked farmers questions, a series of 6 questions, including which land races they grow, how much of each land race, and what are the characteristics that are important for those, when and how often have they experienced drought, and which land races do they think are more drought-tolerant or susceptible. And then lastly, if they grew more or less of a land race after droughts. And this summarizes just a few results of that survey. 60% of farmers reported severe drought, of which 62% were at the drier farms. 63% chose more drought-tolerant land races. And of those, the 4 most drought-tolerant were Ado, Badade, Ganticha, and Gimbawe, just shown in the plot on the right. And the most common characteristics that farmers selected were drought tolerance, good for local agroecology, and diversity of uses. So taking those 4 most drought-tolerant races named by farmers, this is just to illustrate that those are predominantly grown in the drier farms, and especially compared to wild inset, for which I have some coordinates and observation data on, is found in much wetter habitats. And then I wanted to know which of these traits could be plastic and may adapt better or faster to environmental changes. So I ran a genotype by environment analysis looking at those 4 drought-tolerant land races, which I recorded both at high and low aridity farms. And the gist of this table is that these 4 traits had significant effect with aridity, and so maybe plastic. And looking at one of those in particular, leaf wax, we can see that of all the land races here that I recorded, those 4 in red are really in the upper quartile of the range of leaf wax coverage, which suggests that leaf wax might be selected for by farmers and an important drought-tolerant trait. So in conclusion, leaf wax, leaf number, temperature differential, plant height rate, and stomatal conductance were significantly correlated with aridity for all land races. And based on their experiments with drought, farmers were choosing land races due to their drought tolerance. And in the ones that they named were most drought tolerant, leaf wax, leaf number, temperature differential, and stomatal conductance showed high plasticity and thus may be selected for their drought tolerance. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and thank you especially to my supervisors, Dr. Lucy Bushi and Professor Rodenberg at NRI, Dr. Burrell at Kew, Professor Windewek at Addis Ababa University, who's pictured behind me in the photo, and Dr. Rue from the Alliance of Biodiversity in SIAT. And thanks, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I see a question from Phil here. Please go ahead.
Fantastic talk, Rachel. Very interesting to see progress on the enset crop and how you might be able to find scientific evidence to support its tolerance of aridity. Stomatal conductance is an interesting trait, so much as, the density of stomata effectively. Is that the number of stomata and how much they exchange or allow water to escape? Because my question is really, is there a compromise there? Because, of course, stomata are there not only to exchange water vapor, but also to take carbon dioxide in. So is there a sort of a downside to being tolerant of arid locations if you're reliant on fewer stomata?
Okay. Yeah, certainly there is a trade-off of that because from what we're seeing, stomatal conductance is very low in the dry farms, which suggests that plants are closing their stomata to prevent water loss. But of course, that's going to stifle the growth of that plant. So that's why you're seeing kind of bigger plants at the wetter farms and smaller plants at the drier farms. So really, it is a trade-off. And you see that in banana as well. And that's, with my background in banana, it's been interesting to kind of identify the parallels because they're both in the same family. And so both of them really close their stomata quite early on after the onset of drought. Yes.
Question?
Thank you, Rachel. I just want to highlight one of your findings, which is when they were asked about why they were maintaining such or such variety, and they say one of the features is diversity of use, right? So, and I think this is very relevant as well in the line of what I was talking before of how we measure yields or productivity. So we have this, whatever productivity focus we have in this part of the world. And I've seen in other places, and you also highlight here, that people are interested in other issues, no? In these multi-purpose crops, or people just have in their fields this flower because they like it, and they are not just because it's beautiful or because it helped me to grow better this other crop. So all this variety of uses that people who are producing food give to their crops that go beyond productivity in terms of yield per hectare, and that they come to the light when we ask them, why do you use this? Why is this important for you? I think it's so relevant to show exactly what I was talking before, and I think you showed this here. You didn't, you passed through because you are focused more on the tolerant drought, but I think it's very important also what you found here in this regard.
Thank you. Yeah, it's amazing how much farmers know about every different land race and what it's best for, and even though they could have all drought tolerant, they also want some for medicine, or they want some that are good for rope fiber as well, or good for kutcher quality. So they have this great awareness of that, as you mentioned. So it's an interesting path maybe to explore in a later paper.
Looking around if there are more questions. I don't think so. Have you been mic'd up, Marcos? I think so. Yeah, okay. Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
So next on our list is Marcos Paradelo Perez. Oh, okay. Marcos is a fellow in soils at the Natural Resources Institute, originally from Spain. He joined NRI in 2020, coming from Rothamsted Research, where he was working on the strategic program Soil to Nutrition, focusing on the understanding of microorganism interactions with the soil structure and different soil managements. With his research, Marcos aims to improve and maintain soil health in a changing climate as the basis for sustainable agricultural intensification. And today he will be talking about soil health for sustainable agricultural intensification. Marcos, the floor is yours. You just use the big green button.
And this is okay. Thank you, Johnny, and thank you all for coming today. Yeah, we'll talk about what is soil health and how soils can help to sustain agriculture. So probably we need to define soil health if it has just one definition. This was proposed by Lehman in 2020, and it says that soil health is the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, and connects agriculture with soil science to policy, stakeholder needs, and sustainable supply chain management. So quite a long definition. I like more the one from Jason in 21, where they say that soil health is a metaphor. What it means is that this is something that is very complex and we cannot measure mathematically, and we cannot have a single index to use. But we need to see it in the context of for what we use soil and in the context of land and ecosystem. Sorry for using again the Sustainable Development Goals. Yesterday they were also saying there was like soil can help to achieve 3 of them. Actually, well, the FAO says that can use many more, but the important thing is not if we achieve probably these goals, but how we can see soil as giving us some of the ecosystem services that we have. So from food regulation, climate regulation, infrastructure, how we provide the food, fiber and fuel, that is one of the important here when we talk about agriculture, carbon sequestration when we talk about climate change, and nutrient cycling, both as in agriculture but also as a source of pollution, and even how soil can support our cultural heritage. Still, when we talk about how we use soils in agriculture and how we measure or connect with soil health, we can talk of different perspectives from just plant production, but of course when we talk about sustainability, we need to talk about other aspects. It can be just water quality, human health, and climate as part of the a division that was proposed, but it can be different. So there are different management strategies. I will not go through all of these. And there are things that we can measure in soil to see if that, if we are going in the right way. So one of the things that we see in common in all of this is soil organic carbon, and that is one of the things that probably most of the soil scientists that they are funded today are working in soil organic carbon. But I think there are other things that they are important. I will show now a couple of examples of work that have been done with students during this time at NRI that touch some of these aspects. So this first work was a work that we have done in different long-term experiments, just European long-term experiments. This data is from experiment in Lana, Sweden, in Asko, in Denmark, and in Bad Lochstag in Germany. At least 2 of these experiments are plus 100 years old. Lana, I think, is just 80 years old, so not young, but not many years. So in these experiments, even they are different because they try to respond to different things. One commonality is that they are using manure as an organic amendment or also fertilizer. So we wanted to study if that has an effect in the physical properties that they are also used to indicate soil health. So in this example here, we see the plant available water, and we see that it really increased. So the black bars, so as darker is the bar, it means that there's more manure added to the field. So we see that in general we have an increase in plant available water. That is what we expected. Still, sometimes it's even not significant after 100 years of applying every year manure in the soil. And it also changes depending of the type of crop that we have that year. So some of the crops are, some of these experiments are in rotation. And yeah, it depends on the crop that we have in that year. We can see still a difference in what we are measuring. Go back. Same happened for water stable aggregates, so that is more a measure of the structure of the soil. And yeah, we have the same effect. We expect the aggregates, they are more stable when we have more organic matter, but we have things that happen, for example, when we have maize and we don't see that effect. So when, yeah, the main message is that the crop that we have and other things are as influenced as some of the management that we try to use. Other example of things that we're doing is using different types of organic amendments or fertilizers. Here we use, well, the principle of aquaponics, that is reuse fish effluents to grow plants, and yeah, in soil or in other media. In this case, we use soil, and that can use also as fertilizer for the plants, and the soil and the plants. They filter the water that can be reused, or some of them can be reused to keep growing the fish. This, I don't know if you can see in the picture, but here is the catty shark that is there, and this is the well, canary wharf. So this is an experiment that we did in the Stockwell building, in the roof of the Stockwell building here at Greenwich. Again, we could see we grow not this barley, but onions, and we see that we have a grow of using these fertilizers that can be even bigger than using manure. We see also difference in what type of fish effluent we use. If we use just the water, or if we use the effluent as not only the effluent but also the sediments that they are produced by the fish, and that is also showing a bit of increase. So we don't have really we don't know what is the type of release of those effluents, but it's something that we would like to study in the future. Going to Africa, where this conference is more focused. This is a work that has been done by Julius, that is around here today, and it has a poster yesterday. Maybe some could have a look at there. We tried to see if some we call climate smart solutions, or maybe just common sense solutions, sometimes we could say, can improve soil health. In this case in Uganda, so we go to some hilly areas, and Julius took samples at different heights, so in the top, middle, and bottom, and compare plots where they were used some of these climate smart solutions that can be use some physical or mechanical intervention to prevent soil erosion, or it can be the use of different vegetative interventions. We have found a significant increase in organic matter. Again, the typical indicator, the one that is more used. Between the climate smart solutions and the plots with no climate smart solutions implemented. We see also the difference in depth for the organic matter. We see when we are not applying any climate smart solutions, we have the same organic carbon top and bottom of the soil. This is like 0 to 14 and 15 to 30. When we start to have these solutions, we have an increase in organic matter in the top. That is what we expect. So probably what we are having here is that we are losing organic matter in the soils, but in the plots where we don't have any of these interventions. Related with organic matter, we have an improvement in bulk density, so lower bulk density that will help the root development of the plants. But there are some properties that we cannot see any effect, so that might not be a good indicator of soil health in this case. And this is for the conductivity, the water conductivity in the soil. So here we see that it's more related with clay, so with some intrinsic properties of the soil, and not with the interventions that were planned here. And as I said at the beginning, it's not only about increasing organic matter. There are other things that they are important. Here near the Mount Meru in Tanzania, they have soils that they are contaminated with fluoride. Well, this fluoride is coming from the volcanic rocks of, so it's a geological appearance, not human. But we found that using manure, this is cow manure, can increase, so these blue bars can increase the release of fluoride. That fluoride can even go to the groundwater and contaminate the water that can be used for drinking, but it can be also be translocated to the plants and to the fruits, and can be part of the intake diet. In this case, it was in a plot of tomatoes. So, tomatoes. If you think that the amount of water also they have can be a good accumulator of these fluorides. So we tried to find some solutions, and one of them was using biochar for retain or reduce the mobility of this fluoride in soils. Biochar alone didn't work much, as we see here. So we needed to activate that biochar using some nanotechnology. So we use hydroxyapatite. That is a phosphate or phosphorus material, and calcium that helps to. So we could see that we have more sites in the surface of the biochar with calcium that can retain this fluoride, and we see that it works at So it works much better, getting almost 100% removal of the fluoride. And it works at different pHs, so we can use it different conditions in different soils. Some conclusions. So change in soil properties can take a long time, as we see when we see long-term experiments. And sometimes we don't know if we can maintain if we change some of the management or even the crop that we have there. Yeah, there are alternative fertilizers and amendments that can improve soil health and productivity. And some local climate smart solutions can work. How we can implement this in other places is what is still not a no, but that it needs to go for each of the cases. And yeah, soil health is not only organic carbon or production or fertility, but yeah, we need to be careful with pollution and other topics that they are not in the agenda lately. Yeah, mainly I want to thank the students that they were doing most of this work. So Lorenzo, Julius, Ruth, and Yuting. And I got 2 extra SDGs that they were not in the FAO panel. So yeah, it's not, my work here is not only the science or the pure environment, but also I try to collaborate with the social colleagues. So we have a session in the conference in Florence this spring in gender inequalities and soil health. And we are recruiting a PhD student to study the colonization of soil science and agriculture policy. So we will use the archive of NRI of more than 100 years of work in some of these countries, and especially the work of the Land Resource Division to try to respond to some of these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Looking around if there are any questions. I'm mindful of the fact that we are a little bit late in the program, but after this we will have time for coffee. Tim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jonna. A very interesting presentation, Marcos. I read a summary of a report from Rothamsted recently which suggested that quite a lot of recent research has overestimated the extent to which soils can actually sequester carbon. And I guess that's a little bit worrying from the point of view of scientific credibility. But there was also a suggestion that the application of silicate rock, crushed silicate rock, could be an interesting way forward to increase that. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I was visiting the experiment that they have in Rothamsted like a couple of months ago, and I think they have, well, first if I start at the beginning for the overselling of carbon sequestration, probably is, going back to some of the talks that we had before, we try to use the soil as a commodity where we can exchange and sell it as something where we need the soil is to grow fruit for other ecosystem services. And I think from the scientific part, that is the one that I can speak. Probably we are not doing a good job as a soil scientist overselling this. That doesn't mean that is not good to put more organic carbon in the soil. It's very good, but we cannot sell it as the magic solution. And yeah, about the rock, I see that that is working. I don't know, how much it can work. I think the experiments that they have, they are not very long. I think, well, this experiment in Rothamsted and a couple of them, I don't remember what was now the ones that they were leading, if it was in Leeds or another university. But yeah, it's a part of the solution. But I don't know how, from where we get the rock, how we transport that, the CO2 that we are releasing from creating all these rocks to put in the soil. are compensating. Yeah, this is what I'm not. I don't have the data yet, and probably I think they don't have it also.